think, yeah, we'll start now. Okay.
Perfect. All right, everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Nicole Preisel. As Marissa said, I'm the Digital Communications Coordinator here at Wild Bird Trust. And I just want to welcome everyone here. Happy New Year. I know it's, been a very tough year for many people, but it's good to gather, even if it is online. And yeah, so I just want to recognize that Wild Bird Trust is located on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territories of the Tsleil-Waututh people, and it is important for us to acknowledge that at Wild Bird Trust, as we are committed to reconciliation and redress, and making up for any mistakes that we have made in the past. And I also want to acknowledge that I myself am Indigenous. I Stalo from Lackamel First Nation. So I want to acknowledge that the Fraser River is actually very important to me. It is, Stolo means people of the river, and it is, our livelihood. It's, it gives us life. Water is life. And so that's why I'm so excited to welcome Graham Sorenson from Birds Canada, as well as James Casey from Bird Canada. And this will be hosted by Marissa Bischoff, who is also from Wild Bird Trust. And so I want to say a huge thank you for both of you guys for coming and talking and sharing your knowledge with us and your wisdom. And so I'm going to just raise my hands to you. Huge thank you. And yeah, and we can begin. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Nicole. And James, you can share your screen. I'll stop sharing and we'll get started.
I'm just going to say really quick, for anyone who missed my message, we are recording as well as we are live on Facebook. So if you are uncomfortable showing your screen, just make sure to turn your video off and to mute yourself. But other than that, we're good to go. So thank you so much. All right.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Take it away.
Excellent. Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank the Wild Bird Trust for inviting us today to talk about birds at risk in the Fraser River estuary. A heads up that I will probably switch between the term estuary and delta a bit. Generally, we're talking about the area from the US border up until the north arm of the Fraser River, and out into the intertidal and up the river a bit. But we'll pull up a map here in a second. Again, as Nicole has already acknowledged, we'd like to emphasize that this is traditional unceded territories of Coast Salish peoples. And so, but myself not being First Nations, I will not be presenting on Indigenous perspectives at all today. We'll focus on what Birds Canada knows, which is the health and condition of birds in Canada and in the Salish Sea and in the Delta. And so that's where we'll focus today's talk. First, before we dive into the details, a little bit about who Birds Canada is. So we're a national conservation organization focused on conserving wild birds and their habitat. We focus across the country on conservation issues of concern to birds through scientific research, on-the-ground monitoring, public engagement, advocacy, and some partnerships. And a lot of you will be familiar with Birds Canada if you're birders and have participated in various bird counts, Christmas bird count, or use the eBird app, or participating in maybe backyard bird counts. Those types of activities we play a role in helping facilitate those, as well as undertaking some field research, which we'll touch on here in a minute. A bit of, I guess, about myself personally. I hail from a different watershed. So I grew up in the Skeena watershed, and that's where I spent most of my years, actually, I guess half of my life now at this point. And then had the chance to go off to school and have a master's degree in international environmental policy, and have spent my career working on the conservation of rivers in different parts of the province and all different parts of the world a little bit too. So with a really strong emphasis on estuaries. And I am the Fraser Estuary Specialist there for Birds Canada. Graham, a little bit about yourself, maybe?
Sure, yeah, thanks. James, while I'm speaking, maybe you can work on maximizing the presentation. We're still seeing the full window there. Hi, everyone. I'm Graham Sorenson, a BC Projects Coordinator with Birds Canada. Most of my current role is coordinating citizen science programs across British Columbia and the West. And I come from Vermont in the United States, actually, and have moved quite a bit across the US and Canada following bird jobs and bird opportunities, and love birds. Birds are my life and my work, and I'm really excited to talk to you some about birds locally and regionally tonight.
Excellent. And I'll just say before we dive in a bit more, a thank you to Jason Puddifoot for the picture that's behind me. This is a Western Sandpiper, or a flock of Western Sandpipers from Brunswick Point, which we'll be talking about later, but just wanted to acknowledge his great photography there, and you'll see it a couple of times throughout the presentation. One of the things that Graham kind of touched on there is that birds are his work and his life. And for a lot of us at Birds Canada, birds are amazing for a whole range of reasons. We actually love our avian friends for the color and diversity and the friends that we make and the networks that we build around them. But today I just wanted to emphasize 2 points really before we dive into the presentation a bit more. One is this statement here that birds connect our world and really connect us to our world. And so one of the things we love about birds is that if you get out and are starting to observe the natural world through observing birds, you really learn a whole lot about what's happening in your ecosystem and around you. It really allows you to make that connection. And then it also connects us to people that we share those birds with. So as international migrants, birds are a great way to connect with people all across the world. Here in the Pacific Flyway, they connect us from people from Russia all the way down into Central and South America. And so I think this statement about how birds connect us to our world is an important part of why this conversation that we're having today is so critical. And birds are also a great indicator of what's taking place in the environment around us. And so this discussion we're eventually going to get down to the Fraser, but there's a lot that's happening here in the Fraser that's reflecting what's happening in the global context. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis and that we're seeing significant declines in birds as well as other wildlife. And so we have this dual crisis taking place. It's a climate crisis and it's a biodiversity crisis. And so we've made some good progress in the climate crisis in terms of local governments and federal governments making commitments and following through on them. Sadly, we haven't seen that same level of action on the biodiversity crisis. And one of the sayings that we often hear in regard to birds and that linkage to our environment is either the canary in the coal mine is a common saying, or probably a more powerful one for us who are connected to the natural world, the silent spring. And so what's happening to the birds is happening to our natural world, and the story isn't a good one. There are about 1,400 species listed at risk in the world. And we've also seen significant declines in common birds around the world. So there are these rare birds that we're very concerned about, but then there's also declines in birds that you'd see every day. And we're going to touch a bit more on that in a minute.
Yeah, I'll just kind of keep bringing the scale down a little bit as James started us off there. So this paper is from a couple of years ago now, but North American bird trends fit perfectly into this greater biodiversity context. And this publication from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology showed that 3 billion birds had been lost in the past 50 years, equivalent to about 1 in 4 individual birds having disappeared. And this is based on citizen science data, based on a really large, robust data set and showing huge loss in bird numbers. Next slide. And within this, they broke down these groups that are experiencing declines. And this figure is one of the ones that's been used a lot to highlight the groups showing the greatest declines in birds. And this points to British Columbia species quite a bit. So they talk about 29% declines in Western forest birds. Much of BC is forested, and these are species that are in BC's forests. 33% of boreal forest birds are declining, many of which migrate through southern British Columbia. 37% of shorebirds, and Fraser Estuary is one of world-renowned locations for shorebird habitat and shorebird migration. And so very, very critical one to note. And then also a 53% decline in grassland birds. And there aren't huge areas of grassland in this part of British Columbia, but there are quite a few grassland species that winter and migrate through. Next slide. And finally, also a couple years old now, but still very, very relevant, the State of Canada's Birds publication. This is a joint publication from Environment Canada and Birds Canada and a few other collaborators, but looking at Canada perspective on population trends. And finding some very similar, very strong declines, and also some rays of light, huge increases in waterfowl population and birds of prey populations over the past 50 years, largely due to huge amounts of money going into conservation effort for these species, removing things like DDT from birds of prey, huge amounts of wetland conservation to benefit waterfowl. But many of these other groups of species, we're still not seeing strong trends like we'd like to see. Forest birds hovering around steady, but many other species like shorebirds, grassland birds, and especially aerial insectivores declining rapidly.
So we know globally that there's kind of a suite of threats that dominate why we're losing birds. The main one remains habitat loss, and this is from activities such as agriculture, industrial activities, and urbanization. Another major one is habitat degradation from industrial activities, resulting in things like pollution, pesticides, and invasive species. Also, a new emerging threat, of course, or one that we're becoming more aware of, is the threat of plastics and how that's impacting habitat. And then climate change and climate adaptation related impacts are a big one internationally, and also here in the Delta that we'll get into a bit more. In Canada and in North America, direct mortality from cat predation and window collisions is also another source of declines in smaller birds. So if we're going to step down a little bit with that global context in mind and start thinking about what's happening here on the coast of BC. And so one of the challenges when we think about bird populations at that Canadian level or even at the global level is that there are regions that are doing better or subpopulations that are doing better or worse than that Canadian average. And so here on the West Coast, we need to start thinking about how are the birds within the Pacific Flyway doing as compared to other parts of the country. And one of the ways that Canada has approached this problem is through dividing the country up into something called bird conservation regions. The Pacific coast and rainforest habitats are called the Bird Conservation Region 5. And so we're going to present some information on just how the birds are doing within that region. Sorry, I need to skip out of the full screen because I can't see my notes, unfortunately. So within Bird Conservation Region 5, there is a way of considering birds at risk slightly different than what we would our typical at-risk species. So typically when we look at a Sarah or Costawick species or even talk about them in everyday parlance, we're often thinking about species of relatively low abundance or lower populations as compared to historical baselines. But when we're thinking about birds, that the high degree of mobility of birds means that rare species aren't necessarily at-risk species when they're found in a habitat that they may happen to be found in accidentally, or we may not be the major responsible location in terms of what percentage of the population is found in this region. And so we need to kind of rethink this concept of at risk a little bit differently. And so for the rest of the talk, we'll be thinking about birds of regional conservation concern framed around these four concepts. One is that traditional overall low abundance, but we'll also be thinking about common species that are undergoing a steep decline. Sometimes we're talking about species that are faced with a high level of threat throughout their habitat, but yet have not declined yet, but we anticipate given what we know about the life history stage, that could happen. And sometimes we'll be thinking about birds in which this region has a high responsibility for the overall number or percentage of birds of that population found around the world. So those four elements go into thinking about what would be a bird of conservation concern for us. And so, for example, a white-tailed hawk is rarely seen in BC, but really there's only about 0.2% of the population that lives in BC, so that wouldn't really trigger a conservation concern for us. Whereas something like the rufous hummingbird, BC is responsible for about 70% of the global population, and that population is declining rapidly at about 2.5% a year, so that would trigger this regional conservation concern for us. So overall, there are about 24 or so species within the region that occur in BC. So Bird Conservation Region 5 actually extends down into the US along the flyway, along the coast of the US. But not all of the birds listed on that list show up here in BC. So these are a list of birds that would be considered of conservation concern at the scale of Bird Conservation Region 5. And as we mentioned, hummingbirds, rufous hummingbirds are a good example of a species not yet listed under COSAWIC or under SARA, that's under the Species at Risk Act, but a bird that is declining, even though it's something that we fairly commonly see in BC. Outside our window, we often have a rufous hummingbird at our feeder. Unfortunately, this is a bird that has declined 60% since 1974. And so there's a lot of concern that this, what was historically abundant bird, is now getting rarer and rarer. And one of the other issues for migratory birds, when we think about the Fraser Delta as a geographic scale versus the flyway, is where is the threat occurring? And for this particular hummingbird, there are a number of threats that are happening all along the flyway. So there are concerns that the timing associated with when flowering plants are available is shifting due to climate, and that's having an impact on the rufous hummingbird. And then things such as fire suppression or fire forest management can also have an impact on the hummingbird all along the flyway. Another element would be the application of pesticides throughout the flyway. These kind of flyway scale impacts are something we need to consider when we think about birds at risk here in the Delta. How much of a responsibility do we have for the global population, and how much of the risk can we manage? All right, Graham, over to you.
All right, we'll continue narrowing down our scale here. Recently, Birds Canada put out a new publication looking at the British Columbia Coastal Waterbird Survey data set from the past 20 years, and looking at this to find trends over these past 20 years. We did this analysis in its entirety, comparing the Salish Sea with the Pacific Outer Coast. You can see the two maps here. And I'm going to focus in now and talk a bit more about trends we found within the Salish Sea region. So next. So this analysis, the Coastal Waterbird Survey collects data on all waterbird species. So that's everything from shorebirds, seabirds, gulls, as well as herons. And for the analysis, we broke species groups down into different migration strategies. So species that are here year round and breeding locally, short distance migrants, so those birds that spend the winter on the BC coast where there's nice mild winter temperatures, and then go to the interior of BC, for example, to breed in the summer. And then also long distance migrants. So those species like dunlin and snow geese that are flying to the Arctic or into the northern boreal forests to breed for the summer. We also broke the analysis into 4 distinct foraging groups. So piscivores, those species that are diving for fish. Benthivores, you can think of the scoters and goldeneye species that are diving down and grabbing things like mussels from the bottom of the ground, but also species like dunlin that are foraging in the intertidal for insects and other intertidal benthivores. Herbivores, all of our dabbling ducks and geese, and omnivores, many of our gulls and a few other species that have a quite varied diet. Okay, next. And when we looked at, so this is looking at the migration trends. On the left, you have long distance migrants, short distance migrants, and local as the 3 species groups. And all 3 of those species groups in the Salish Sea showed strong declines, whereas all 3 of these species groups in the outer coast actually showed positive trends over the past 20 years. So clearly no significant effect of migration strategy on what's happening on our coasts, but a significant effect differing between the outer coast and the Salish Sea, suggesting strongly different environmental pressures experienced by birds in the Salish Sea. Next. And we get a similar picture when looking at diet, comparing the Salish Sea with the outer coast. So these gray bars are showing declines for most diet groups for the Salish Sea. Herbivores showing constant trend over the past 20 years, but piscivores, benthivores, and omnivores all showing declines. On the outer coast, piscivores are actually doing well, as are herbivores, and the other 2 population or other 2 feeding groups are stable. But the big ones to note here are piscivores and benthivores, showing strong declines and making up quite a large amount of the species wintering in our Salish Sea. Piscivores have often been documented as declining over the past few years in seabird studies, not just in BC's coast, but in the Arctic and in other oceans as well. But benthivores showing strong declines here as well. If you can go to the next slide. There are a few great to see stable trends throughout the Salish Sea. So when we looked at Salish Sea, there's actually 36 species that have stable trends across the time period. And it's 12 species that are declining. And so it's nice to highlight some of these stable trends because a stable trend over 20 years is a great thing. Horned grebe is one of them. Horned grebes were listed by COSEWIC in 2009 and are showing pretty stable populations across the 20 years from this survey data. Great blue heron, another federally listed species that from this survey and in the Salish Sea is showing steady trends, which is great news. Glockenstwing gull, the most common gull species on our coasts, showing stable trends, but clearly visually here a slight decline over the past 20 years. So it's of note that even really common species like this, like James mentioned earlier in the presentation, are showing declines across this time period. Okay, next slide. So these are the 12 species showing negative trends across the Salish Sea in these 20 years. I haven't put species names here for all of them, but the important things to note are that a number of these species are benthivores. So we have the 3 scoter species here. We've got surf scoter, white-winged scoter, and black scoters in the bottom left. We've got long-tailed ducks, and then we've got dunlin and black turnstone, which are all benthivores and all declining in the Salish Sea. So we also have several top piscivore species, so western grebe, common loon, and Pacific loon being the most prominent. and then a few other species that we see declining trends in as well. But the big thing to highlight here is that 6 of the 12 declining species are benthivores. So clearly there's something going on in the benthic environment in the Salish Sea that's affecting birds. Next slide. And just to look a little bit further into some of these negative trends, here's the trend line showing steady declines for surf scoter over the past 20 years. Very similar to steady declines seen in all the other scoter species in common loon here, and also the scaup species that we looked at. We looked at them combined together because they're so hard to tell apart. 2 other species that it's worth mentioning in the context of the Fraser especially are dunlin. Dunlin use the Fraser estuary in globally important numbers, and we'll talk a bit more about what that means, but large percentage of global populations migrate through Fraser Estuary and use it at a single time. And so Fraser Estuary is extremely important for this species, both as a migration stopover and as wintering habitat. And we're seeing declines over a 20-year period. And trumpeter swan as well. The Coastal Waterbird Survey is not a great survey for picking up trumpeter swans because a lot of their winter habitat use is spent in agricultural land or other inland grassy areas. So it's not a great survey to pick up on them, but we are seeing declines even so across 20 years. And that could easily point to some of the land use changes that are happening on BC's coasts. Next. And finally, only two positive trends out of the 20 years of data in the Salish Sea. Ringneck duck, a species that, like many waterfowl species, has benefited from wetland conservation that's been going on for the past 50+ years. And so great to see positive trends of that species. And then very unsurprisingly, Canada goose is doing well in the Salish Sea. We all know how adaptable a species this is, and their populations are showing it in the Salish Sea. All right, next.
Excellent. So that's kind of gets us down now to the scale of the Fraser Delta. And so when we talk about birds of conservation concern within the Fraser Delta, it's important to keep in mind this broader context of what we're talking about. And when Graham has spoken about birds at risk in the Salish Sea, it's important to remember that connectivity between projects proposed on the Delta and impacts of those projects beyond just where their physical footprint is out into the sea. And so water quality just through wastewater discharge or runoff or shipping impacts, and those kind of trans-boundary or trans-ecosystem impacts are something that are playing out as well. The Fraser Estuary itself and the Fraser Delta, which in this case I'd include the agricultural lands and Burns Bog and some of that lower lying landscape, it's really hard to overemphasize just how important this habitat is for a whole range of species. It's been internationally recognized as a Ramsar site of Ramsar wetland of international significance, an important bird area, a Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network site, has a couple of federal and provincial designations as well. Most recently, it's one of the first sites in Canada to be recognized as a key biodiversity area. A lot of that is associated with its importance to birds. There are at least 24 different bird species that are found in this delta in percentages of global significance. And then key biodiversity areas also are now starting to consider other species found in the ecosystems, for example, plant species or, well, the whole range of species per se, but we're starting to look at things such as streambank lupin as a plant species, or Georgian bog spider as an insect species with a habitat range that's really reliant on the delta. So this is, it's like I said, it's beyond really my ability to say how remarkable and important this particular site is for biodiversity conservation at kind of continental scales. So I will do my best at that and just move on. But of the 263 species, well, here are some of the species for which the site has triggered that international recognition or that key biodiversity area recognition. We have dabbling ducks such as long-tailed or pin-tailed, American widgeon, mallards. We have swans and trumpeter swans, as Graham talked about, western sandpiper, which we're going to get to here, and dunlin, gulls and grebes. There's a long list of species that this place is important for. And these are birds that we share with the world. And so, unfortunately, there are 69 species of birds in the Fraser Delta that are at some level of conservation concern, either globally, nationally, or even provincially. And those things range from the smallest aerial insectivore up to this iconic subspecies of great blue heron that we often see when we're driving along. And that reflects declines in a whole range of different habitats. The barn swallow definitely doesn't use the same habitats as the great blue heron, but both species are challenged. So most of the time when we think about species at risk when we talk about species at risk, we're thinking about species listed under the Species at Risk Act in Canada, or also have been reviewed and listed on by the expert committee responsible for recommending listings, which is the Costiwit Committee. And in total, there are 23 bird species that are listed within that occur within the Fraser Estuary. And some of them might be a bit surprising in terms of the fact that we do see them fairly regularly. But like I said, sometimes we have a high percentage of the global population and we're just lucky enough to enjoy some abundance that other people are experiencing rarities. We also have 19 additional species that are listed under the provincial red or blue ranked system. And while that listing doesn't actually provide much in the way of protection for these species, they are legitimate conservation concerns associated with them. And we really do need the province to act and implement that endangered species legislation that the NDP promised but never delivered on. Because there are a lot of provincial related resource issues, things like agriculture, forestry, transportation, all fall within a provincial mandate, yet have impacts on these birds. And so the key threats that we are seeing across the Fraser River estuary key biodiversity area are really associated with transportation infrastructure, climate-related coastal squeeze, urbanization, agricultural land conversion, and invasive species. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on conservation or transportation infrastructure. So just a quick summary on climate-related coastal squeeze. This is an issue that's related to sea level rise driven by climate change and how we adapt to it. So as you probably heard in other presentations, the Fraser Delta has lost in the range of 70 to 80% of its naturally functioning habitat. A lot of that naturally functioning habitat is on what we would call the wet side of the dike. So the dike that's on the intertidal side where we still have a lot of salt marsh and intertidal mudflat. Unfortunately, as our communities adapt to climate change, one of the issues, one of the approaches being taken is raising that diking infrastructure. And as sea level as the sea level rises due to climate change, it floods that remaining marsh habitat. And that's an issue around the world for shorebirds. And one of the reasons they're considered a conservation of concern. Urbanization, kind of is self-explanatory, but the growing number of people in the region is taking up more and more of the landscape and also using more and more of the resources and natural habitat for things like recreation and wastewater management. And so there's that direct footprint associated with urbanization, but then there's also those indirect impacts. Agricultural land conversion is a challenging one for us. a lot of the habitat used by waterfowl, and part of why waterfowl are here in such high numbers is because in-soil agriculture, so the traditional agriculture practices, have been very beneficial for birds, and farmers have made sacrifices to try and realize co-benefits for both their farming practices and that bird population. So they've been quite generous in helping us maintain our bird populations. Unfortunately, there are new types of agricultural practice that are coming onto the landscape that don't provide that co-benefit. Things like greenhouses, berries, marijuana facilities don't provide that same habitat for waterfowl. And as that spreads across the Delta, we're losing that co-benefit. So that's a big issue for us. And then the last one on the list right now that we'll just touch on is invasive species. And we do see a couple of species that are concerning. Spartina is an intertidal plant that grows in the marsh habitat and changes how that habitat functions. It captures more sediment than existing marsh plants and leads to an increased elevation, which reduces the amount of mudflat habitat available to shorebirds. And concerningly, European green crab has also recently been found in the Delta, which has an impact on eelgrass habitats. But we're just learning more about that. The one that's really concerning and really difficult for us to deal with right now is transportation infrastructure and the cumulative effects of multiple different types of transportation related infrastructure projects. And so we'll talk a little bit about Roberts Bank Terminal 2 here, but about 2 decades ago, the decision was made by our leaders that the Fraser River Delta was going to become something known as the gateway to Asia. And with that commitment has come the investment in hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure projects across the Delta. Roughly one number I've seen is $12 billion worth of infrastructure investment. And that's resulted in things like the perimeter road around Delta, or the twinning of railway tracks, or the expansion of bridges, the widening of bridges. It's also responsible for the proposed Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project, dredging within the river, and unfortunately, looking forward into the future, even more additional projects such as the expansion of the airport at YVR, or the new proposed Tilbury Island LNG. All of these projects are having the cumulative impact of reducing the connectivity and function of the Delta, which has a negative impact on bird populations overall. In terms of trade, to date, that Gateway to Asia project has been successful in increasing trade over 300%. So while we've lost birds and we've lost habitat, we have seen a huge increase in international trade flowing through the port. And really it's triggering a discussion about, have we benefited enough and need to start giving more consideration to some of the other species. One of the species that is being impacted by this increased transportation infrastructure is our barn owls. And so barn owls are an example of a species at risk due to low population abundance. So there's only around 250 to 1,000 barn owls located in southern BC. Narrowing that number down is quite a challenge because barn owls are nocturnal and are quite secretive. And so it takes some dedicated and often paid staff to go find barn owls, whereas most of our bird numbers are derived from volunteer experts or volunteer surveys. And so that expertise and that challenge of finding barn owls has made it difficult to identify exactly how many there are in the region. Barn owl experts have estimated that within the boundaries of the Fraser Delta key biodiversity area, that there's roughly 126 breeding pairs of barn owls. Barn owls are quite amazing to watch as they feed, and you can watch them in the dawn. If you know where one's located, watch them at dawn or at dusk. And they like to fly nice and slow and low over the ground, silently, slowly going along close to the ground, and rely heavily on hearing animals move within the ground cover or under the snow before swooping down for a kill. That slow gliding over the fields, or unfortunately along road verges, makes them quite vulnerable to mortality by being struck by vehicles. And so one of the species that was reviewed or looked at in detail by the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project review panel was barn owls, and they did find that barn owls would be subject to significant cumulative effects. And that due to a couple of sources of increased traffic. So as you bring in more containers, you need to move more containers along the roads. And so you'll see an increase in both truck and train traffic, resulting in increased traffic along some of the main arteries. And that leads to an increase in mortality. As well, you'll see an increase in people just as the port becomes bigger and busier. You'll need more staffing, and you'll see an increase in people just commuting to and from work. And you also see an increase in traffic commuting to those pieces of infrastructure around the port, so customs or sorting bins or the new Amazon facility. And all of that increased traffic also leads cumulatively to more barn owl strikes. And so that was an issue of concern within the review panel discussions. And it was recommended by, I'm just gonna, sorry. Unfortunately, one of the shortcomings of the environmental assessment process, and especially Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012, which is the old act, which this process is being considered under. So if you'll remember, we used to have an Environmental Assessment Act, and then the Conservative government came in and changed that act, reducing some of the stringency into what is known now as shorthand as CIA 2012, and then the new Liberal government has introduced a new act called the Impact Assessment Act. So Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is being considered under that old, less stringent piece of legislation, CIA 2012, and in that, the issue of cumulative effects is very poorly dealt with. And the outcome of that was that increased traffic in and among or along the Delta Port Way and the other main arteries was never actually considered within the review process, because they were allowed to scope that out, because there weren't significant collisions along the causeway, which was the physical footprint of the facility. But we know full well that these increased traffic is an incidental outcome of the proposed project, and there are a number of nesting sites in close proximity to the routes that these traffic will be taking, leading to concerns around barn owl. Environment and Climate Change Canada did recommend mitigation actions to put up solid barriers along the road so that you would avoid these kind of collisions. What happens is the barn owl comes along, spots these solid barriers, goes up higher and bounces over the road out of danger of a collision with a vehicle and then pop down on the other side. The port has decided that they don't want to implement those mitigation actions, and so these threats remain for that particular species. A second species which you've all heard a lot more about, I'm sure, if you're following the port or bird related issues in the Delta, is the Western Sandpiper. And so the Western Sandpiper is a case of having a region having a high global responsibility. There's roughly 90% of the global population of Western Sandpipers will use the Fraser Delta as a stopover site as it migrates along from South Central America up into the breeding grounds in Alaska. We get peak numbers of over 100,000 sandpipers in the Delta, and they use Roberts Bank, Boundary Bay, and to a lesser degree, Sturgeon Bank and around Iona Island. And this is a case where there are also high levels of threat to coastal mudflats. So we know because of this coastal squeeze issue and the desire to develop on intertidal habitat, that we are losing that coastal habitat all along the flyway. And indeed, we're losing mudflats all around the globe. And so we know that both we have a high level of responsibility for this one population, but we are also losing habitat along the flyway. If you want to go out and see some Western sandpipers, Brunswick Point is a great spot to visit. Brunswick Spot or Boundary Bay sometimes, if you go to some of the large mud flats on a rising tide, you can see some remarkable flocks. So the challenge with Western sandpipers is that we really didn't understand a key element of the life history until the environmental assessment process for Roberts Bank Terminal 2 was well underway. It was a discovery by Dr. Bob Elner and colleagues that really transformed our understanding of how Roberts Bank Terminal 2 might potentially impact this feeding area and these birds. Up until the early 2000s, bird experts thought that sandpipers were like a lot of other shorebirds in that they were feeding on crustaceans in the mud. So when we saw them out at Roberts Banks, it was believed that they would be feeding on small invertebrates in the mud for probing with their bills. But it turned out that the Western sandpiper are actually using their tongues. This is a very zoomed in image of the sandpiper's tongue in the upper left to slurp what is a very thin layer of something called biofilm off of the mud at the Roberts Banks. And that was discovered while the EA process was underway. And so I think we heard a little bit in the previous presentation that the Wild Bird Trust has put on, that the time lag between discovering and publishing and then being able to take conservation action is actually quite long. Whereas an EA process is meant to happen over the course of a year or two. It was really the complexity of this EA process that dragged it out and allowed us to understand more and the researchers to understand more and communicate to the panel what was happening. And so as the researchers learned that sandpipers are using their tongues to slurp off this biofilm, the question started to arise about, well, why have Western sandpipers evolved to make use of the biofilm, and how could the port potentially impact the biofilm? And this became a centerpiece in the discussion and debate about the type of negative impacts Roberts Bank Terminal 2 might have on the birds of the Delta. And so we learned through research by folks like Dr. Patricia Bard, that biofilm actually contains something known as long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, and that these fatty acids aren't like fats. They don't actually power our muscles, and they don't power the migration. They actually play a role within the physiological makeup of birds and the metabolic processes of these birds that enable them to make more efficient use of that energy source, and therefore make the long distance flights from what is this last key stopover site all the way up into Alaska. And so the discoveries kind of unrolled slowly as we went through the EA process. And again, after we learned about this role of fatty acids in the bird's metabolism, the question became, well, why biofilm, and what was so important about these fatty acids and the content within biofilm that meant that they had to be here in the spring to harvest this on their next, in preparation for the next flight. And again, this was a discussion that researchers at Environment and Climate Change Canada, Bob Elner and others were looking at. And after a couple of seasons of field work, realized that it's likely a combination of salinity, temperature, and elevation that are triggering very high levels of this fatty acid, these within the biofilm, and making it available for birds if they arrive just on time to harvest it and or to consume it and make the next leg. So then the question became, well, how could Roberts Bank Terminal 2 have an impact on this fatty acids? And so over the last year, 2 years, field work has been underway looking at that impacts of salinity. How does Roberts Bank, the proposed project, impact salinity or elevation or sediment, and what could the impacts of that be on the production of this fatty acid and therefore the availability of this essential nutrient to the shorebirds and therefore the long-term viability of this population. And the researchers at ECC concluded that if the project went ahead as proposed, the changes in the salinity caused by this new island, which basically acts as a dam to the flow of water, both from coming in on the tides and being discharged from the river, would interrupt that salinity trigger and thereby limit the amount of fatty acids available and have knock-on effects in terms of the fitness of the bird in their migration. And so that's what Environment and Climate Change Canada put into the process. It said that there would be non-mitigatable population level impacts on Western Sandpiper. That's one of the strongest statements I've ever heard from Environment and Climate Change Canada stuff in an EA process. But as this is new and emerging science, and as the process isn't really geared towards respecting peer-reviewed research as much as it should, that recommendation or that statement never made it all the way through to the final panel report. And so right now we stand at a panel recommendation that says they were unable to decide on the significance of the impacts. And unfortunately, while the port has promised to deliver further information on impacts related to salmon and killer whales, we haven't seen that same promise forthcoming with Western Sandpiper. As one kind of closing thought on the story around fatty acids and the fact that this knowledge emerged as we went through the process, we are still learning about the role of fatty acids within the food chain in the Fraser Delta. Patricia Bard has highlighted that none of the animals that higher level animals which occur within the Delta are actually able to generate this fatty acid themselves, and that zooplankton provide an essential source for these nutrients. And so the question is, what is the food chain or food web related impacts for birds and salmon and all other steps along the way of potentially losing this primary production? And so when we think about what is the fate of the Fraser Delta, that connection to the tiniest little organism to changes in the flow of water or salinity And the fact that we just discovered this 2 years ago as we went through the process really highlights how little we know about the health and function of our system, and was key for us when we were thinking about what is the future viability of some of these species that occur in the Delta. And so the work by Tara Martin and Laura Cohey and others at UBC really highlighted the low level of confidence we have in our ability to manage and sustain the 102 species that were identified, and there's likely a lot more going forward. And so we really think at Birds Canada that we need to try and set out on a different path. A key part of that path is to stop walking down the road we are on right now. So we're calling folks to reject Roberts Bank Terminal 2. A lot of the folks listening on this call are from the North Shore of Vancouver, and so we'd really encourage you to reach out to your MPs on the North Shore of Vancouver. Jonathan Wilkinson has a key role in this decision. There are letter campaigns underway that we're running one where we're asking people to write in support of a petition that Roger Emsley has launched, calling on people to reject Terminal 2, and the Green Party has carried that forward to Parliament. So Parliament will be debating this petition. So now is the time to get in to your MPs and say, you support what this petition is asking for. We also need to spark a conversation online about the project and what our vision is for the Delta. And so, like I said, 2 decades ago, somebody made a decision that the Fraser Delta was going to become the gateway to Asia. There's been millions and billions of dollars put in infrastructure, but we've never really had a conversation about what that means for the salmon or the birds and the wildlife that live and rely on the Delta. And so we need to start and spark that conversation online. So we'd encourage you to share some videos, some content, this presentation and others. And we really need to reestablish a freshwater estuary management plan. So we're going to get into that in the discussions, but I think a key element of that is we need to get to a long-term vision of restoring a relationship of positive reciprocity with nature and the environment. Land and the water are what we rely on, and we need to figure out how to give to that positively.
Great. Thank you, James and Graham. That was great.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions in the audience? We can maybe take a few before we leave off. Otherwise.
Yeah, that was really good. I actually, yeah, like I was mentioning, I had missed the previous forum or webinar that we had right before Christmas. And so it was really good to listen to you guys, and you guys had like just some amazing wisdom, and I just appreciate you guys sharing that with us and yeah, and just, teaching us, and that was really meaningful.
So we have one question, couple of questions from Prabha in the chat. They're asking, why can the Roberts Bank project not be assessed in the new environmental impact assessment?
So, I mean, there is no absolute reason why it couldn't be. I think in terms of economic continuity and confidence, governments like to keep a project that has started down a certain regulatory road within that regulatory road. But the government does have the powers to change that direction if it decided it wanted to. And so one of the things that we have been suggesting is that because there are now 2 competing projects at that site, so there's the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 and the Delta Port 4 project, both providing the same desired outcome of increased container traffic, that the government should undertake a regional environmental assessment or a regional impact assessment, which is a tool to look at the larger ecosystem and the multiple projects within that, and then make informed decision based on which one provides the outcome with the least amount of impact. So, I mean, that would be an option if the government wanted to, but we have to convince the government that that's what they want to do.
So Jonathan Wilkinson, he kind of paused the decision making on the project. It was in August, and then he sent that letter back to the port to come back with more information based on some of these concerns. I know you've been doing this, looking at this project for a few years now, and you've had some experience elsewhere in the world with nonprofits. What's your personal sort of prediction on like how this project will play out? Do you see it playing one way or the other?
I think the fact that there is a competing project that has different types of environmental impacts means it's going to be a very interesting conversation for cabinet. I think without that project, they would probably push it through. But there are some real thresholds in terms of Chinook salmon, killer whale underwater noise that are already being passed. And so how to deal with mitigation of those impacts within the context of sort of what's realistic for a project like such as this makes it kind of unlikely that they're going to find an easy answer to that. So yeah, and I mean, I also think there are important legal challenges that are likely going to be forthcoming if they try and skirt some of the obligations here. And it's an important, like I said, it's a globally important piece of habitat, and so the world really is watching and will flag issues if they develop.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's good thoughts for sure. Noah Quastel asked, you mentioned that there's broader estuary planning. Is there any kind of preliminary vision statement or is there a good precedent from another jurisdiction?
Okay, so as a bit of background, so there used to be something called the Fraser Estuary Management Plan and the Burrard Inlet Action Plan. I can't remember what Burrard Inlet Action Plan. I'm missing something in there, but I think the new plan that the Tsleil-Wautuths have developed for the Burrard Inlet is something that would be precedent that I would say you would want to go look at for the estuary. Another piece of precedent that's probably worth looking at are places that have considered the rights of the river. And so one of the challenges within conservation regulations in Canada is that we really are existing in a framework where our regulations are about extracting resources. It's really an old colonial mindset. And so we need to look to places where the framework shifts. And this is part of why I spoke to that vision about setting up positive reciprocity with nature, is how do we shift and where do we look to in the world for that shift? So that's part of the piece. I mean, here at home, another potential place to look would be the North Coast Marine Planning Partnership and some of the processes they went through there. And then there's the new blueprint that West Coast Environmental Law, UBC, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance has come out with, that I think Graham can put a link up to, that gives some principles as well. Yeah.
And there's even management plans that like other First Nations have already developed. So there's lots of potential there for kind of collaboration too, even.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll get a few more questions in, if that's okay with you guys.
Yeah, no word, no rush. I spoke long. I mean, it's our audience that might have got bored with the content, but.
Okay.
It was good.
So we have another question here from Jacob. Since BC does not have an Endangered Species Act, it seems the actions mostly fall into the hands of the federal and government and its partners. That being said, what role can the provincial and municipal governments play in the conservation of bird species?
Yeah. Graham, do you want to talk for a minute, or do you want me to tackle it?
Graham's like,
Then go for it.
Okay. Just so one thing that the province still can do is they can improve their commitments under legislation. So they did promise new endangered species legislation. The government can follow through on that and implement that. This term, the government has also promised a coastal protection strategy, and protecting estuaries is something that could be included within that strategy. So both of those pieces are important steps that the province can take. The province also has a number of what's known as wildlife management areas that cover the delta. So Sturgeon Bank, Boundary Bay, and Roberts Banks are all partially covered by rather large wildlife management areas. And so those plans, unfortunately, are out of date. Some of them were never even finished. So you're looking at 1995 kind of timelines. And they don't actually contain measurable targets, conservation targets. And so those wildlife management plans could be updated. That's going to take a significant commitment to resourcing the process of updating management plans and engaging with nations in a way that's authentic. And so far, we haven't really seen that kind of leadership from the province, but I mean, that's possible. Within the Water Sustainability Act, there's also the ability to create watershed plans and water objectives that could speak to ecosystem function. And again, the province could step up and deliver on those, but that takes political will.
Yeah.
At the municipal level, things are actually pretty positive. We've seen some really great steps from local government, given the fact that they are subsidiary to the province, so they can only do so much, but a number of the municipalities have passed bird and biodiversity strategies. So the city of Vancouver and the city of Delta both have bird strategies. City of Richmond and city of Surrey have biodiversity strategies that include bird habitat. So those have been great steps. And the city of Richmond and the city of Delta have passed resolutions calling on Prime Minister Trudeau to reject Terminal 2. So those have been some great actions as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that you as local governments, people living in the local government area could do is that Michael Weave of the city of Vancouver has requested that a task force be set up to establish a Fraser Estuary management plan. You can reach out to your various levels of government in support of that and say, we would suggest you participate on that task force.
Right. Now, just a comment from me is a lot of the advocacy and probably more recent years in conservation kind of has fallen to nonprofits. So if you're looking to find out how to support these efforts, is maybe go to your local advocacy groups or nonprofit groups that are doing this sort of work in a focused way.
Yeah, and so I'm going to just say that BC Nature and Nature Canada have been partners in trying to conserve key biodiversity and IBAs along the coast of BC. And so identifying your local naturalist group or reaching out to Nature Canada could be some of the people you could connect with.
Right. Yeah, so the next thing will be the last, I think, question from the audience. And I have one last thing I want to ask. But so it's another comment and a question from Amy. So she says, it's so fascinating to know that the nutrient content study is so recent. We know our delta is special. So what particular spots in the estuary have this rich nutrient content, i.e. the biofilm, for the Western Sandpiper, besides the mudflats at Brunswick Point?
Yeah. Okay, so we know that they feed in higher numbers at Mud Bay as well. And so Mud, kind of at the mouth of the Serpentine Nickelmackle River, though we think that there's some increased levels of biofilm there. Once upon a time, there were higher numbers at the Iona Beach, or the mudflats there. So possibly there, but really it is actually just that small little field of mud
Mm.
at Upper Brunswick Point that is the critical place. And
And it's almost like, because it's such a recent discovery, we don't know how much might have been there in the past even, or to see how track it, how it's changed over time.
yeah, well, and that's a really important struggle for the Delta is we have very poor baseline information that we are actually considering in the process. So the input of the Indigenous communities have been very limited into these processes, and they are really the knowledge holders on what the Delta looked like historically. And so until we figure out how to do a better job of engaging those communities, we're not going to have that baseline.
Yeah, that's a really important point there, I think. Yeah, so I think I just want to end off by saying, and this is kind of for the benefit of everybody watching, I had an instructor in school who would always say, have an elevator pitch, 2-minute elevator pitch. If by some crazy chance you ended up in an elevator with Environment and Climate Change Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, what are like the 3 to 5 points, key points to convince somebody that our Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is something we should reject?
Yeah.
Now you can both contribute.
Yeah, I'm gonna let Graham go first.
I think one of the big ones is around some of the biofilm questions is that we don't know enough still about the importance of some of these sites, and making sure we know more and we understand all aspects of this more before we further destroy or potentially destroy habitat is really important. I think that's a big one. I'll let James go farther.
Elevator pitch. Okay, so his government has committed to being a leader on biodiversity conservation around the world. This site is the most important piece of habitat in Western Canada for birds and international migratory birds. It is a key biodiversity area, and that the decision to invest in port infrastructure is undermining the health of this internationally recognized habitat. And his own scientists have said that the project will have non-mitigatable impacts on a population of birds that we share with the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah,
if
so even if the
says,
government,
yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll end on that very deep note. If anybody has any more comments or questions, you can send them to volunteer@wildbirdtrust.org, and we'll see how we can answer those. And just want to say thank you to Graham and James. That was really thorough and very informative. And I feel like myself and lots of other people have learned at least, not a lot, at least a few things from it. So this is great. Yeah, so thank you so much. And actually, awesome. I wanted to say, Wildbird Trust.
Oh, I think you froze a little bit, Marissa.
Sorry, Marissa, could I just say before we jump off,
yeah,
that
go ahead.
Monitoring and getting that baseline is so critical to informing decisions. And the coastal water bird survey stuff is some of our best long-term data. And so if anybody's out there on the coast that wants to contribute to conserving birds, get a hold of Graham and talk about how you might be able to get out and do some counting, because those numbers are essential to us making our case.
Yeah, and if you want to get involved in science, then you find it, you don't know where to start. Citizen science is really a great way to jump in, and Birds Canada has like very broad and really detailed program that you can get involved with for sure.
Sweet.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just want to show you our upcoming events before we head off. So this Saturday, we actually have a basics of birding. It can help you with your citizen science efforts. It's going to be given by one of our kind of senior board members, Kevin Bell. And then I think next Thursday, we'll have an iNaturalist workshop with the BC iNaturalist project coordinator. And so she'll show you the kind of ins and outs and how to use the app and using it for citizen science. There you go. And then The next one after that is the Saturday, January 16th. And if you're interested in volunteering with the Wild Bird Trust, you can learn more about our organization and the different ways you can become involved in conservation, reconciliation, and arts and culture, which are all a part of our mandate. And that's it. And make sure you guys sign those petitions and those letter templates that were shared in the chat. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. Nicole, do you want to end it off?
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, James. Thank you, Marissa. It's amazing. I learned so much. And yeah, from the bottom of my heart and to everyone watching here and online, Hochka, and I hope you guys have an amazing night. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.